Hello everyone, today we will step into a forgotten corner of English royal history, one rarely spoken of, one nearly erased. Picture this, a stone chamber thick with damp air, high above the Thames. A child sits wrapped in velvet, too pale, too still, the weight of a crown he will never wear pressing invisibly upon his thin shoulders. This is not just a tale of royal lineage, it is the chilling unraveling of a boy named Edward of Middleham. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments. Was Edward simply a victim of sickness, or of something much darker? Edward was born in the winter of 1473, during a time when the Wars of the Roses had left England bleeding but unbowed. His father, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was not yet king, but already feared and respected. His mother, and Neville, came from a bloodline as tangled and stormy as the crown itself. When Edward arrived, the court greeted him with hope. A male heir. A boy to continue a legacy. But hope, in royal households, is often fragile. Edward's health was never quite right. From infancy, he coughed often and slept too long. His nurses whispered when he didn't walk at the proper age. He was small for his years, with deep hollows beneath his eyes, and a stare that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Even as a toddler, he rarely smiled. His tutors praised his mind, sharp and quick, but his limbs failed him, and winter often left him bedridden. Some said it was just weakness. Others, those more superstitious, murmured of a curse. Still, the court clung to him. When Richard ascended the throne in 1483, becoming King Richard III after the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, Edward was raised high and declared Prince of Wales. The coronation was swift, as though the crown could not wait, as though time were pressing on them all. A boy not yet 10 was dressed in fine ermine, his thin wrists lost in sleeves meant for a stronger child. The people cheered, but quietly, as if unsure whether to believe in the pale prince whose feet barely touched the ground when he sat on the ceremonial throne. Richard loved his son. That much was true. Witnesses recorded the way he bent toward Edward in court, speaking softly, shielding him from harsh weather. But that love was edged with something else, urgency, perhaps, or desperation. Richard had seized the throne in a storm of scandal, and with enemies on every side, he needed Edward to be seen, to be believed in. But Edward was fading. In 1484, just 1 year after his father's rise to power, the boy grew ill again. It began as a fever, then turned to a sickness of the chest. He was moved from Nottingham to Sheriff Hutton Castle, and then finally to Middleham, their family's stronghold in the north, where he had once been happiest. Some said he died there, quietly, in his mother's arms. But others remember it differently. A servant, long after the fact, claimed that a covered litter left the castle by night. No one saw the boy again in public. Not at court. Not at church. Not even at his supposed funeral, which was held behind closed doors, with no body present. Richard and Anne mourned in private. Their grief was described as bottomless. But grief can be honest, or it can be a mask. Years later, scribes and servants alike recalled how Richard's face grew grimmer after that year, how Anne seemed to shrink from view, as though carrying a secret too heavy to speak. And then there were the Tower whispers. But that is for later. In 1484, all that was known, publicly at least, was that the heir to England had died young. The line of Richard III had ended before it could begin. But behind the thick walls of Middleham, some swore they still heard a child's cough long after the bells had tolled. Edward was gone, or so the kingdom was told. But something didn't add up. The declaration of his death came with neither procession nor proof. No royal guards bore his casket through the streets. No carved effigy was raised at York Minster. Only whispers lingered, low and uncertain, like a draught that slipped through cracks in the stone. Richard III, ever the tactician, turned inward. Those who once saw him smile at his son now caught only hard glances and clenched hands. The crown weighed heavier, his enemies grew bolder, and still, no new heir appeared. And Neville, always delicate, now seemed ghostly. She kept to her chambers, her eyes always cast downward. Some said she mourned. Others said she feared what had been done. Behind closed doors, Richard made strange arrangements. A new household was discreetly installed in the lower levels of the Tower of London, one rarely accessed and not listed in the official ledgers. Food was brought by trusted servants, never the same ones twice. And the Tower's old physician, a man known for both silence and skill in dealing with frail bodies, was summoned from retirement. Why, many asked, would the king require such secrecy, if his son was truly dead? Some began to wonder if Edward had not died, but been hidden. To protect him? Or to conceal a darker truth? Court loyalists spun their theories. The Lancastrians, they said, might have plotted against the boy. Better to remove him from view than let enemies strike. Others murmured about witchcraft, that Edward had fallen under a spell, his soul dimmed by unseen forces, and was being quietly treated in seclusion. But outside the castle walls, the explanations grew colder. The boy, they said, had failed. Not just as heir, but as symbol. His weakness undermined Richard's already fragile claim to the throne. And in an era when kings ruled by strength and sons by spectacle, a sickly child could not be allowed to stand in the light. And so Richard, once a father, became a strategist once more. In the months that followed, Richard's attention shifted to Elizabeth of York, a Tudor rival whose lineage threatened his crown. He paraded himself through the north, gathering support from nobles, never once acknowledging the hollow echo where his son's name should have been. But the truth, whatever it was, did not stay buried. In the tower, a chamber remained sealed. A single guard was stationed outside, silent and stony. Once a week, a veiled woman entered, bearing trays covered in linen and sealed letters. The guards never searched her. They never dared. And still, no one saw the prince. Until the rumors began. A kitchen boy, barely 14, swore he heard a child crying through a grate while scrubbing pots below the eastern wall. Another servant claimed he'd seen small footprints in the frost one morning, far too small for any of the tower guards. A nursemaid, dismissed under mysterious circumstances, left London in haste. In a drunken haze weeks later, she told a tavern crowd of a boy with eyes like glass and skin too pale for life. The image spread, a boy alone in stone silence, drifting between fever and waking dreams, forgotten by a kingdom he was born to rule. Some said he was blind now, that illness or injury had robbed him of his sight. Others said he'd been blinded on purpose. Theories turned dark. Political rivals pointed fingers. What happened to the Prince of Wales? They asked. What did Richard hide in that tower? But Richard said nothing. His silence roared louder than any denial. In March 1485, Anne Neville died. Her passing was quiet, sudden, and shrouded in as much mystery as her son's. The king did not remarry. He wore black, but his eyes had already drifted beyond grief, toward war, toward Bosworth, where fate would meet him with sword and treachery. But somewhere beneath London's ancient stones, a boy, if he still lived, waited in the dark. Waited with bandaged eyes. Waited for a name no one dared to speak aloud anymore. London sweltered under a heavy summer sky in 1485, the kind of heat that clung to walls and stirred tempers. But deep inside the tower, sunlight never reached. Cold stone held its breath as the world outside marched toward war. In a chamber few remembered and fewer dared mention, the boy who had once been Edward of Middleham no longer knew what month it was. He barely knew day from night. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the scraping of a door bolt, the soft shuffle of slippered feet, and the faintest scent of damp herbs that tried in vain to mask rot. He was not called Prince anymore. No one addressed him by name. The veiled woman, she might have been a nurse, a jailer, or something in between, simply called him child. When she fed him, it was wordless. When she washed his hands, her touch was distant. Once, long ago, she had sung. But that, too, had stopped. He did not speak much. There was no one to answer. His eyes, once bright with a quiet intelligence, were now clouded over, milky and vacant. Whether by fever or force, he no longer saw the flicker of candlelight that danced across the stone. Whether he had been born to fade or made to vanish, no one could say. Only the silence remained. Outside, the kingdom shifted. Richard III, desperate and cornered, rode toward Bosworth Field to face Henry Tudor, one final gamble for the throne he had taken with blood and whispers. Those loyal to the House of York watched with unease, knowing their fortunes, their futures, and perhaps their very lives depended on a single battle's turn. And yet, in the Tower, none of this mattered. To Edward, if he still answered to that name, there were no kings, no Tudors, no wars. There was only the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. Only the soft scratch of rats along the edges of his prison. He reached out sometimes, hands trembling, seeking the edge of his cot or the warmth of another body. But he always found only cold linen and the slick surface of stone. He began to hum. Quietly, tunelessly. A sound to anchor him. A ward against the dark. The veiled woman, she had stopped coming every day. Sometimes 3 days passed with no voice, no food, no footsteps. He lay very still during those times, unsure if he was alone or simply forgotten. Then, one night, different. A key turned. Not the usual quiet shuffle, but a harsh, deliberate scrape. Boots. Not slippers. Voices deep, male, urgent. He froze. There was a moment, long and breathless, when the door opened. He felt the warmth from the hallway sweep over his skin like a foreign wind. Something clattered. A word was spoken, something Latin, maybe. Then footsteps crossed the threshold. Hands grabbed him, not cruelly, but with haste. He did not cry out. He had forgotten how. The voices argued. One said, "Witness." Another said, "No proof." A third simply said, "It's too late." They left again. The door slammed. The darkness returned. But something had changed. That night, the veiled woman came one last time. She didn't feed him. She didn't wash him. She sat beside him, silent. Then she whispered, "Your father is dead." He said nothing. She took his hand. "Henry wears the crown now." Still, no answer. Then, "You must forget who you were." And finally, "You will be moved." But he was not moved. Not that night. Not ever. 3 days later, the guards arrived with lime and linen, and sealed the door for good. The cell was never reused. And just like that, the prince who had been, disappeared again. This time not into shadows, but into memory. The Tower of London does not easily forget. Its stones, soaked in centuries of whispered secrets, remember what others wished to erase. Long after the battles were lost, the kings slain, and the crowns passed into different hands, some rooms in the tower remained locked, not by key, but by silence. Years passed. Henry VII now reigned, having defeated Richard at Bosworth. The Tudors moved swiftly, cleansing what remained of Yorkist loyalties. Their scribes rewrote records. Their heralds recast bloodlines. Their agents scoured the realm for threats, real or rumored. But there was one rumor they never addressed aloud. The blind boy in the tower. They could not prove he had lived. No body had ever been shown, no public death confirmed. But too many voices, low, urgent, afraid, spoke of a child kept hidden under Richard's orders. A child who could, if recognized, challenge the Tudor line. Henry VII was no fool. He knew the danger of ghosts. And so, his men came quietly to the tower. They did not ask questions. They did not seek witnesses. They went straight to the chamber, its location passed only through whispers among the surviving guards. But when the door was forced open, what they found was not a threat, but an echo. The room was empty. A straw-filled cot, decayed with mold. A stone basin, still stained. A single carved wooden toy, half buried in dust. And on the wall, scratched with fingernails or perhaps a shard of bone, a name, Edward, followed by the faint outline of a sun. The men stood in silence. No remains. No boy. No answers. The chamber was sealed again. Officially it did not exist. But the whispers spread faster than fire in dry hay. A clerk told his wife, who told a cousin, who told a printer. Soon, ballads were sung in taverns across the countryside, songs of the blind prince beneath the stone. Children whispered dares to each other at night, to say his name 3 times by moonlight and hear his weeping echo back. The tower guards, many replaced since the old reign, grew wary of that wing. Some refused to patrol it. Those who did came back pale, shaken, muttering about a child's cough heard through the walls, or a lullaby echoing from an empty cell. In 1497, during a minor rebellion in the north, a man claiming to be a surviving York heir emerged. He named himself Edward. He was tall, confident, and had the look of nobility. But when questioned, he stumbled over court details, confused dates, and faltered in Latin. The impostor was hanged. Yet still the rumors would not die. Later that year, a letter was intercepted in Calais, meant for a nobleman in Brittany. It simply read, "The boy was blinded. He lives no more, but we were all made to watch." No signature. No seal. Some say it was a lie. Others a confession. And some, a very few, believed it was a warning. Because even in death, Edward of Middleham had become dangerous. Not as a living rival, but as a story. A weapon of memory. The tower began to change after that. Rooms once shuttered were repurposed. Records were purged. Guards were reassigned. And the chamber beneath the northern wall, where nothing official had ever occurred, was bricked shut. But those who laid the bricks swore they heard something inside. A voice. A hum. A quiet, broken song that stopped the moment the final stone fell into place. Time passed, as it always does. Monarchs rose and fell. The Tudor rose bloomed, then withered. The Stuarts followed, and with them, fire and war. Yet beneath the shifting tides of English power, the Tower of London stood unchanged, a sentinel of stone, watching and waiting. And though the centuries wore on, the blind prince did not fade from memory. He lingered, in stories, in shivers, in the cracks of brick that never quite sealed the truth. Tour guides never spoke of him. History seldom wrote his name. But in the tower's shadow, his tale endured like a bruise beneath fine silk. Some said he was seen, once every few decades, always by someone new. In the spring of 1612, a mason repairing the northern wall fell from his ladder without warning. When roused, trembling and pale, he spoke of a small boy in the shadows, dressed in royal blue, hands stretched out, eyes empty and white. The mason left London that very day. His tools were never reclaimed. In 1741, a prisoner scrawled a poem on his cell wall before execution. In stone he waits where voices hush. His fingers trace the past in dust. The boy who saw the crown too near still hums beneath the walls we fear. That wall was scrubbed clean. The poem was copied by a jailer, who died a year later of fever and spoke only Edward's name in his final hours. By the 19th century, the legend of the blind prince had become a staple of Gothic storytelling. Penny dreadfuls spoke of the child king undone. Poets invoked him as a symbol of innocence crushed by ambition. A painter, haunted by visions, rendered an image of a young boy in chains, surrounded by darkness, with glowing eyes that saw nothing, but knew everything. The painting now resides in the private collection of a former royal historian. It is never displayed publicly. And yet, for all the macabre tales and theatrical flourishes, there remains a cold core of fact. Records lost. A death never confirmed. A room sealed and forgotten. Even now, modern archaeologists avoid excavation near the tower's northeast wing. Instability, they say. Historical sensitivity. But those who've mapped the substructures claim something odd, a chamber that doesn't appear on any blueprint, yet disrupts magnetic readings. A space full of stillness. There are those who say the tower should be left alone. That not all ghosts want to be found. And still, some nights, when the fog rolls thick along the Thames, visitors speak of hearing music. A tune half-formed, rising from the stone itself. A child's voice, humming softly, endlessly, as if to remember something the world worked so hard to forget. Edward of Middleham, son of a fallen king, prisoner of his own bloodline, never truly escaped that tower. Not in life. Perhaps not even in death. His name was carved away. His likeness lost. But in the coldest corners of England's oldest fortress, a question lingers still, unanswered, unspoken. Was he truly dead when the world let him go?